Hey, good morning. Today is day 30 of our 31-day challenge where we have been studying together the book of Proverbs. I said day 30. That means we're in the home stretch. If you would, go ahead and turn your attention to the Word of God and specifically turn to Proverbs 30. I've entitled this chapter, Wisdom's Brute. Chapter 30 begins a new section of Proverbs. This chapter includes the Proverbs of Agur. And it's in verse number 2 where he describes himself as brutish, which means he hasn't had formal education. Agur is wisdom's brute. And first of all, I want you to notice his profile in verses 1 through 3. He mentions his father in verse 1 and two other individuals in verse 1 who are very likely his sons. He says of himself in verse number 3, I neither learned wisdom nor have the knowledge of the holy. Yet in spite of Agur's obvious self-deprecation, he goes on to describe God powerfully. So secondly, consider the power of God as Agur explains it in verses 4 through 6. There are rhetorical questions asked in verse 4, and the answer to the first four questions is God. Then it's divine that Agur mentions that God has a son. That's a remarkable statement for an Old Testament individual. And of course, we know that his son's name is Jesus of Nazareth, who is the Christ. He is Lord and he is God. As Agur continues to explain God's power in verse number 5, he emphasizes that every word of God is pure. He is a shield unto them that put their trust in him. And then Agur expresses a word of warning in verse number 6. Add thou not unto his words, lest he reprove thee, and thou be found a liar. It reminds me of Revelation 22:18, in which the Bible explains, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. Let me just tell you, these for-profit companies that keep coming out with new Bible versions, they're tampering with the Word of God. The King James Bible is God's inerrant, infallible, and preserved Word for English-speaking people. It's a dangerous thing to be tampering with the Word of God. But then thirdly, Agur offers a prayer. It's been called a bucket list prayer. He wants God to grant him these things before he dies. His prayer is the only prayer listed in the entire book of Proverbs. And the first thing that Agur asks is that God would remove from him anything that would hinder his walk with God, such as vanity or lying, mentioned in verse number 8. But then secondly, Agur prayed that God would not give him anything that would hinder his relationship with God, such as poverty or even wealth. Verses 8 and 9 explain that to us. And Agur's reasoning is that money, or the lack of money, often create two extremes, both of which lead to a distance in our relationship with God. In many people, wealth creates an unhealthy independence from God, yet in contrast, poverty often creates deep-seated bitterness towards God. And more than anything, Agur just wanted to be pleasing to God. So in summary, Agur's prayer is, God, before I die, I want to live for you and therefore be pleasing to you. Hey, so I ask you, what's your bucket list prayer? Maybe you could comment below and share some of your bucket list prayers. Share some of the big things that you want God to do for you before you die. But then fourthly, in verses 10 through 14, Agur mentions various people groups. A generation that's disrespectful to their parents, and another generation that is pure in their own eyes, but in actuality, they're filthy. Then he mentions a generation that is arrogant and proud. But then in verse number 14, he mentions people who are vicious and greedy and cruel. And sadly, people like this exist in every generation. And yet even more sadly, glimpses of each of these things enter into our own hearts, if we're honest. But then fifthly, Agur finishes the chapter with parables. These verses can be divided up into 6 sections and therefore teach us 6 primary lessons. If you read through verses 15 through 17, you'll see that his point is anyone who mocks their parents will ultimately live a life of endless dissatisfaction. But then 18 through 20 teach us that there are people who do obvious wickedness, but then they say, I have done no wickedness. Then in verses 21 through 23, the lesson has to do with the odious woman. And the word odious is the idea of hateful. A hateful, catty woman gets married, and of course she's a constant battle to her husband. But then verses 24 through 28 teach us to prepare for the future through the ant. And the coney teaches us to build strong homes. And the locust teach us to have initiative and to be self-governed. And the spider teaches us to be resourceful. Then verses 29 through 31 showcase 4 comely illustrations. Comely means good in this verse. And the overall point is that when the king is good, the people will be good. And there will be no rising up from the people. But then lastly, verses 32 and 33 explain the benefits of not forcing an issue, churning the proverbial butter, or wringing the nose, end up bringing avoidable wrath upon yourself. It's better to just be quiet and let an issue die down than to constantly stir up and force an issue. So by way of conclusion, in spite of the fact that Agur lacked formal training and referred to himself as brutish, clearly he possessed lots of heavenly wisdom. Agur is wisdom's brute. This is what the Lord taught me from Proverbs 30. Please comment below and let me know what the Lord taught you as you studied this chapter. And please plan to join me tomorrow as we consider aspects of Proverbs 31 and as we finish this 31-day challenge together.